Hello, my name is Michaela, and we will be talking about the NASM Certified Personal Training exam and how to pass this exam on your first attempt. Today I will be talking about 10 tips to pass this exam. So let's get started. First off, I purchased the Certified Personal Training package, which came with the NASM hardbook cover shown here. And with my purchase package came the ebook, which was convenient if I was on the go and wanted to read something. Along with that came modules for each chapter. So I believe there's 21 chapters in the textbook. And with that, you could read through each module, the important parts, as well at the end of each module, they gave you a practice exam. So each practice exam was 10 questions, and you could repeat this exam as much as you wanted until you successfully passed. How I got started with the NASM package. So I started and I read each chapter, every page through the book. I read it over the summer, and then I stopped in the fall and didn't really think about it. And then November I was like, I need to pick this up. I purchased it. So I studied for 2 weeks, around 3 to 4 hours a day. I sat down and I utilized everything I had. So the modules, the practice exams, my textbook, any resources. I reached out to some people that had also passed this exam. And one thing I did do, I scheduled my exam for December 4th, so I couldn't give myself any more excuses. Scheduled it, studied, and took my exam on December 4th, and I passed with the first attempt. So study tip number 1, first and foremost, I would say one of the most important things to know is the OPT model that NASM expects their people and trainers to know. So in this model, there are 5 phases. So the stabilization endurance, strength endurance, hypertrophy, maximal strength, and the power phase. And with these, I would just suggest knowing obviously all 5 of the phases, and then how would you use the OPT model with your clients and their goals. So for example, if you have a client that wants to reduce their body fat, what stage would you put them in, or what phase would they fit into? Going into step number 2, study tip number 2, know the blood flow of the heart. This can seem super simple, but in the exam you'll get at least 2 or 3 questions on this. So in chapter 3 of the textbook, I have the 6th edition model, so the page numbers may differ. But in my textbook, it's page 57, and it has a very nice picture of the heart and all the ventricles that are on there, so it can help you study that. So the biggest things to know are the 4 chambers of the heart, and then how the blood flows through the heart. So where does it come into the heart? Once it's in the heart, where does it travel, and where does it exit? So the big things I remembered was it goes from the right atrium to the left ventricle, and then from the left atrium to the right ventricle. And I remember this because A comes before V, so it goes to the atrium and then the ventricle, and then it leaves the heart. A study tip that helped me visually see this was the Khan Academy, and this was just the blood flow through the heart video. Study tip number 3, found in chapter 5 of the textbook, Human Movement Science. So here it's very important to know the planes of motion, so sagittal, frontal, and transverse. You need to know which exercise are performed in each plane of motion. So for example, a biceps curl is performed in the sagittal plane of motion. In addition to this, know all the muscle actions, so isotonic, eccentric, concentric, isometric. This can be found on page 91, again, if you have the 6th edition book. In addition to all this, chapter 5 is super important, but I would mainly focus on the planes of motion, those exercises that are performed in each plane of motion, and then the muscle actions as well. Study tip number 4, going right into chapter 6, fitness assessment. This is huge, probably the biggest part of the exam. One thing to know is the difference between subjective and objective information. So subjective information is client history. So this is stuff like their occupation and their lifestyle, things that you can obtain from the client without observing them physically. Objective information would be information gathered about the client. So this would be their physical assessments, so something you would obtain by watching them, or information given straight from their doctor, things they can and can't do if they're restricted. So those are two things to know, subjective and objective information. You'll get questions about that on the exam. Another thing to know from Chapter 6 are the heart rate zones and the percentages that go with each zone. So for example, Zone 1 would be 65 to 75% maximal heart rate. Know those, you will get questions on that. Another thing to study in Chapter 6, cardiorespiratory assessments. Know these, for example, the YMCA 3-minute step-up challenge, the Rockport walk test, just practicing those yourself, getting familiar with it. Those are pretty easy to remember. And then in addition to this, common distortion patterns. So the lower cross syndrome, what muscles are overactive and underactive. Upper cross syndrome, same thing, knowing the muscles that are shortened or lengthened with these common distortions. Know the kinetic chain checkpoints for, let's say, the overhead squat assessment, the single leg squat assessment, the pushing and pulling squat or pushing and pulling assessment. And for these, make sure you know the overactive and underactive muscles. This is probably the biggest part of the exam and the most difficult to study. So some things that helped me remember these overactive and underactive muscles for observing dynamic posture would be, for example, the overhead squat assessment. So you need to know lateral view, frontal view, and posterior view. So possible overactive muscles found on page 144 of the textbook. I remembered this as HAGS, so H-A-G-S, H standing for the hip flexor complex, A standing for the abdominal complex, G standing for the gastrocnemius, and S for soleus. So HAGS, that's how I remembered it, lateral view and overactive muscles. Example for the underactive muscles of the lateral view would be age, so anterior tibialis, G gluteus maximus, and E erector spinae. Big things to remember, overactive and underactive muscles of all those dynamic posture assessments that you'll be doing with your clients. Moving on to step number 5. Tip number 5, found in Chapter 7, the flexibility concepts. So here, know the mechanism of action for each and how long each set will be held. So for example, the corrective flexibility, active flexibility, and functional flexibility. So here, corrective flexibility would use SMR, foam rolling obviously, and static stretching. So this uses autogenic inhibition or reciprocal inhibition. You need to know all of that. You would do 1 to 3 sets and hold for 30 seconds and repeat until your third set is complete. Active flexibility, again, is SMR, foam rolling, and active isolated stretching. And this uses reciprocal inhibition. This would be performed 1 to 2 sets, and you hold that stretch for 1 to 2 seconds and 5 to 10 reps in each set. And then functional flexibility would be SMR as well, and dynamic stretching. This uses reciprocal inhibition. And in addition to all this, you do need to know where corrective flexibility gets performed. So that's in phase 1. Active flexibility gets performed in phases 2, 3, and 4. And then your functional flexibility gets performed in phase 5, going back to that OPT model that I talked about in step number 1. Study tip number 6, chapter 14, integrated program design and the OPT model. Again, we can obviously see the OPT models coming in all of these study tips. So know your acute variables and how they relate to the OPT model. How many reps and sets do you perform in the stabilization phase? So obviously phase 1 of the OPT model. How many do you perform in the strength endurance phase, the hypertrophy phase, maximal strength, and power? And then this is found in chapter 14 here, and there's a table for all of these. For example, chapter 14, page 379. So the power phase, table 14.11, you can see that the flexibility would be 10 to 15 reps, 1 to 2 sets. The tempo is controlled. So you need to know pretty much this entire table for each phase of the OPT model. So phases 1 through phase 5, found in chapter 14. Another thing to know from chapter 14 is the progression continuum. So this is not a huge part of the exam, but definitely something to know. So a client would start on the floor, something very sturdy and stable. They would move up to something as a balance beam, and then onto a half foam roll to challenge their stability, to a foam pad, to a balance disc, to a wobble board, and lastly to a Bosu ball. Something to know, not super important, but just look over it at least. Going on to study tip number 7, chapter 17, nutrition. So there's not a whole lot to know here. One thing to make sure you do know for the exam though are the 3 macronutrients, so obviously carbohydrates, protein, and fats, and the recommended dietary allowance intake for each one. So protein would be the 10 to 35% daily caloric intake, carbohydrates would be 45 to 65%, and fat 20 to 35%. Study tip number 8, found in chapter 10, the balance training concepts, so the balance mechanisms. Know the sample exercises and the level or each phase that it goes with. So balance stabilization exercises would be the single leg balance reach, single leg lift and chop, etc. Know that for each phase. So then power phase would have a whole different set of exercises. In addition to chapter 10, glance over chapter 9, the levels of core training. All the exercises are super important to know. You never know which ones you will get on the exam. You're expected to know all of them, obviously. So know the core stabilization exercises, the core strength exercises, the core power exercises, and be familiar with the drawing in maneuver and the bracing maneuver. So drawing in would obviously be bringing that belly button in towards spine during that exercise. Study tip number 9, you need to know the 10 steps of success in their exact order. They may ask you, like, what is step number 4 on the exam, and you just need to know it. It is obviously multiple choice. You don't get a pen or paper or anything to write down, so it is just kind of from memory. So those can be found in the textbook, or if you have the online web stuff, you can look on there. Know the acronym for the SMART goals, so specific, measurable, attainable, reasonable, and timely. You'll have to set some up for your clients. Obviously, I don't think I had any questions on the exam about this, but it's something to be familiar with. And then definitely know your 4 P's of marketing, so the product, price, promotion, and place. Know those. Those are simple to remember, but it is something that is of importance. And then study tip number 10 isn't really regarding any more information. It's just what helped me the most. So again, I read through the entire textbook, which, to be honest, was boring, but I think it was helpful because I knew where all the information was. From here, after each chapter, I would take the study exam from each chapter, and I took it until, I think you have to get at least a 70%, and if not, you can retake the exam. It'll give you different questions, but that really helps you get familiar with the information. And then from here, after I took each practice exam, I'd go and type up each question with the answers, so I could go back and refer to them when I was studying at the very end. So this is the packet of each chapter that I did with all the questions and the answers, the correct answers, so I could easily look it up. So that is one thing that helped me. Another thing that helped me, I printed the exam blueprint handout before I started thoroughly studying. This just helps me know what they expected. So on here it gives you the percentage of what will be on the exam. So domain 1 was 17%. The highest domain was domain 4, the exercise technique and training instructions. Obviously that was my #1 priority right there. And then the least was domain 6, the professional development, and that would be like the 10 steps to success, the 4 Ps, etc. So it's just nice to have this handy to know what they are expecting of you. In addition to that, I did print off the NASM Certified Personal Training Study Guide handout. This was just a simplified version of the textbook. I would highly recommend having this on hand. If you don't get a chance to read through the entire textbook, read through this 3 or 4 times before your exam. Super helpful. This is all the information that you will need to know on the exam. So in addition to what I provided, look at this. And then with my package, I had 2 full practice exams at the end of the course. So once I finished every module and all the practice things on there, I could take the 2 final exams and it would give me like a relative example of how I would do on the exam. I passed both of those, and so it made me confident going into my actual exam on December 4th. And I think the biggest thing to know is if you study all the material, if you're real with yourself, you're going to pass the exam. What you put into this is what you'll get out of it, and obviously you want the best for your clients, so put in that effort for them. And lastly, the last thing I do have to say is when you do go into that exam, go in knowing that you've studied all this material, you've read the textbook, you did everything you could, you know it all, you've saw it all, and you just need to recall it now in the exam. So go in, be confident, and you will pass. If this video helps you and you like this kind of content, please like and subscribe to my channel. Comment below with anything you are struggling with or have struggled with, and I will try to reach out to you guys. Thank you so much for stopping in on my channel, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye!